In this particular video, I want to show how easy it is to build automations using Automation Anywhere. A great place to go to for such exercises is our community website, and if you click on the challenges link, go to challenge pages, and you'll then see a series of exercises of varying degrees of difficulty which you can use to test your skills as an automation developer. Now, the one we're going to be working through today is this employee data migration. And in this particular challenge, every time you load this form here, you'll be presented with a randomized employee ID. And what you need to do is look up that employee information within a legacy Windows.NET application, which is provided here. You also need to look up the employee data from a REST API, combine that information, key it into the form, and then click on submit. And we need to loop through and do that 10 times to complete the challenge. So let's take a look at how we would build that using Automation Anywhere. Here we are in the Automation Anywhere control room, and I'm going to go to a folder here I've created specifically for this exercise. And we would normally start with a bot template, which has all of our organizational logic around error trapping and standards and that sort of thing. But I want to show building an automation from scratch here. So let's do that. And what I'm going to therefore do is click on create a new bot. And I'm going to break this down into two components, or well, a parent bot and some child bots, which will actually do the data entry, while the parent is going to be responsible for the looping logic. That's just a nice way I find to structure these kind of automations. So let's type in parent and create our bot. And the first action we're going to need to add to our logic here is the looping action. Now, the looping action can be configured to loop for based on a condition. You can loop for data that's in a CSV that we've opened, data in a database, in an Excel file, various ways of looping through, but we're just going to be looping through a fixed number of times, 10 times here, so we have everything that we need at this stage. The next thing we need to do is add a browser action to open up the particular web form, which will give us our data entry form and our randomized employee ID. So there's the URL. Let's take a look at what that form looks like. Note when I open it that there's our employee ID pasted in there. We just need to make sure that we're not reading that field too fast and getting a blank value, because you can see there is a short delay there before that populates. So we'll test our logic to make sure we're actually getting values into our variable as we run that. The next step we need to perform is to read the data or read the value from that field. Now, when we're interacting with user interface objects, the command we use, or the action, is the recorder. Now, recorder can be used in two ways. I can just drag across an individual recorder step, or I can trigger a process where it's recording what I'm doing on the screen and building up a series of steps automatically. Now, in this case, I just need to read a single field, so it's much easier to just drag across a single recorder step, and we'll look at the other way in a moment. So there's my step. I need to read from my browser. I'll refresh the list and pick the particular browser window. And then I click on capture to go and look at the different controls on the page here. Notice how we get this red outline as it's identifying all of the HTML controls. To pick a particular control, I simply highlight it and then click. And what it does is capture all of the attributes of that control here, which will be used to identify that within the HTML page. Now, what we want to do in terms of an action is retrieve data from one of these attributes. So I want to read data from an attribute. Which particular one? Well, let's go down and look at the attributes that we have captured. And I'm looking for that employee ID. We can see here that it is captured within the HTML value attribute. So that's the particular one that I want to read from. So I type that in here, and then I'm going to need to write that to a variable. So let's create a variable to hold that value. We'll call that the emp ID. And notice as we save our variable, it immediately populates it in our configuration there. And the next thing I want to do is provide some way of just checking that we've actually retrieved that variable, to do a bit of testing. So I could use our debug capabilities. Another simple way is just to pop up a message box and show the actual value that we've extracted. So I will drag across my message box action, select the emp ID as the variable to display, and we're now right to give this a test. Now as we click on run to test our logic, the first thing that happens is the logic will be downloaded from the control room server to execute on our own computer here. So it's going to pop up on my other window. I'll just drag across the bot window here. Notice it's opened up our first screen here, and there's our message box showing the value that was extracted, and that matches. As we perform another iteration, there's our data that's been populated, and our message box shows that we've successfully extracted that. So this seems to be working quite well here, so I'm happy with this. It seems reliable. Obviously you do more testing, but I'm going to move on to the next phase of my automation. So let's kill this logic by coming back here, clicking on stop and closing our dialog windows. Next, I'm going to want to take this value here and perform a search for that employee ID in my Windows application by typing in the value here and then clicking on search. I then want to read all of the values from these fields into variables so I can use them later in my data entry process. So when I have a series of related steps like this, I use the step command to group my logic into easily understandable phases or stages through my automation. It makes it much easier to understand the automation logic. So I give this step command a sensible description here explaining what it's doing. And this time I'm going to use the recorder utility to automatically generate all of my actions based on what I'm doing with the application itself in the user interface. So I select my employee database here, I start my recorder, and notice as I move across the application here, just as you saw before, it's highlighting the objects. I type in my search parameter here, my emp ID, click on search, and what I want to do is read the data from each of these fields here. Instead, at this stage, I'm going to click on them, and that's going to generate a click action for those fields, which I can adapt later to be reading the properties of the field for my variables. So let's stop our recorder, and notice how all of those actions have been automatically generated for me. So the next thing I want to do is just edit these as necessary. So now we can do any minor configuration of these actions. Firstly, I will put in my employee ID parameter rather than a hard-coded value. In the click on the button, I don't really need to do anything there, so we can leave that one. Note how where I clicked on the remaining fields, it's interpreted them as a set text action. I actually want to get the value out of the field, so we change that to get property. And taking a look at the properties that it detected here, notice it's detected it as Microsoft UI automation, not browser-based this time. And the field value is actually in the value property. So I simply paste that into the property name field. And whoops, I also need to assign that to a variable. So I can use that later on for the data entry task. So let's create a variable. We'll call this first name. And we can then move on to the remaining fields. So for each of these fields, it's just simply a matter of repeating the same thing. I input which property I want to retrieve, and I create a variable to hold the value so that we can leverage it later on. Given there is quite a few fields here to work through, I'll jump ahead in the video to the point where we can look at the next steps. Okay, so here we are having configured all the remaining fields as a get property action with the variable values. The next thing I want to do is actually ensure I'm clearing the field in between each of these records. So we need to click on that clear button. To add in another action, I can just copy one of the existing ones here, which is a nice quick way of doing that, and then recapture the object from the form by highlighting our clear button and selecting that. And that's just a good step to do. in between each of the records that we leverage. So next I want to look at debugging this. So let's look at how we can see whether we're retrieving all these values. There's quite a few to fetch. So rather than use the message box, let's see how we can use the debugger capability to do that. So I'm going to click here to choose all of the variables to monitor within my debugging window. And when using the debugger, you need a breakpoint typically, so the logic is going to stop somewhere, and you can set these under the list view here. So I'm going to put a breakpoint just before I click on that clear button so that I can see all of the values in my variables. So it's run via the debugger. Notice it kicks off our automation logic, and we can monitor the steps as it's looping through. See how it stopped on step 17? That's where we had our debugger breakpoint, and that allows us to go back to our debugger window here and see all of the variable values that have been extracted. So it seems our logic is working fine at this point in time. So I think I will end this video there, and what we will do is create a second video to show how we can fetch the data from the REST endpoint and combine that with the information we already have now, so we can begin to enter that into the web form. So as a placeholder, I'm going to add another step command for get data from REST endpoint, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.